Sometimes the hardest truths are buried right beneath our feet, just waiting to be found. When aging cowboy Eli Boone spent his very last dollar on a patch of forgotten scrubland, he wasn't searching for fortune, he was looking for peace. A quiet place to rest alongside his faithful mare, Clementine. The old barn stood half-collapsed, choked with tumbleweeds and decades of dust. But beneath the rotting floorboards, Eli discovered something that would shake him, a hidden cellar filled with Confederate gold, secret journals, and a blood-stained ledger revealing his own brother's betrayal. Now, in the twilight of his life, Eli faces an impossible choice. What would you do if everything you believed about your family was a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over the West Texas scrubland, painting the horizon in shades of burnt orange and dusty purple. Eli Boone sat astride Clementine, his faithful mare of 19 years, and surveyed what now belonged to him, 40 acres of forgotten earth, dotted with mesquite and sage, bordered by a fence line that had surrendered to time decades ago. At 67 years old, Eli looked every bit the weathered cowboy he was. His face was a map of creases earned under the relentless southwestern sun, deep lines carved around eyes that had seen more than their share of disappointment. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, still held the reins with practiced ease, though arthritis had begun to claim his fingers joint by joint. Clementine shifted beneath him, patient as always. The old mare's coat, once a brilliant chestnut, had faded to a dull copper streaked with white. Her muzzle had gone grey years ago, and her gait had slowed, but she remained steady. Eli reached down and patted her neck, feeling the familiar warmth of her hide beneath his palm. They had been together since she was a 3-year-old filly, and he was a ranch hand in his prime. In all those years, through every season and every hardship, she had never let him down. In truth, she was the only constant companion he had ever known. The property deed rested in his shirt pocket, still warm from his chest. $847, every cent he had left in the world, had purchased this abandoned parcel from a banker in Persimmon Creek, who seemed surprised anyone wanted it at all. The land had changed hands twice before, the clerk had said, but nobody had lived here in over 20 years. The previous owner had simply stopped paying taxes, and the county had been more than happy to sell it off for whatever they could get. Eli had not bought the land with any grand ambitions. He was done with grand ambitions. He had spent 49 years working other men's ranches, sleeping in bunkhouses, earning just enough to keep moving from one place to the next. He had no wife, no children, no family to speak of. His parents had died when he was young, and his only brother Samuel had been dead for 2 decades. The circumstances of Samuel's death had always sat uneasy in Eli's gut. A riding accident, they had said, in some unnamed place Samuel had drifted to after the war. The body had been buried before Eli even received word. He had never seen his brother's grave. What Eli wanted now was simple, a place to rest, a place where he could die with some dignity, where Clementine could graze in peace until her own time came, where he would not be a burden on anyone or beholden to another man's mercy. The land was poor, the structures barely standing, but it was his. That meant something. He urged Clementine forward, and they approached the barn slowly. The structure leaned hard to the east, as if a strong wind had tried to push it over, and nearly succeeded. The roof sagged in the middle, and several boards had fallen away from the walls, leaving gaps that offered glimpses of darkness within. Tumbleweeds had piled against the northern side, and the whole building seemed held together more by habit than by nails. Still, it was shelter of a sort. With some work, Eli thought, he might make it serviceable enough to keep the rain off. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge, the bottom corner dragging in the dirt. Eli dismounted carefully, feeling the familiar protest in his knees and lower back. He led Clementine forward and pushed the door open wider. It scraped against the ground, the sound harsh in the evening quiet. Inside, the air smelled of dust and decay, of wood slowly returning to earth. Shafts of golden light slanted through the gaps in the walls, illuminating floating motes of dust. The floor was littered with debris, bits of rotted leather, rusted tools, an overturned bucket corroded with age. At the far end, he could make out the remnants of stalls, though the dividing walls had mostly collapsed. A hayloft remained overhead, but Eli would not trust his weight to those boards. The whole place groaned and creaked with his presence, as if disturbed from a long sleep. He found a relatively clear spot and tied Clementine's lead to a support post, then retrieved his bedroll and saddlebags from her back. His possessions were few: a change of clothes, a dented coffee pot, a tin plate and cup, a small sack of dried beans, some jerky, a bit of coffee, and his old revolver wrapped in oiled cloth. He had not fired the gun in years, but he kept it clean out of habit. He set about making a crude camp in the least damaged corner of the barn. As he worked, his mind wandered to the years behind him. He had been 17 when the war between the states began, too young to understand what it would mean, too eager to prove himself. He had lied about his age and joined up with a Texas regiment, leaving Samuel, 2 years younger, at home with their ailing mother. Eli had survived 4 years of that war, though he carried its marks in his bones and in dreams that still woke him some nights. When he had returned in 1865, everything had changed. His mother had passed the previous winter. Samuel had grown hard and distant, working odd jobs and refusing to talk about those years. The brothers had tried to find their footing together, working the same ranch outside of San Antonio, but something had broken between them. Samuel was secretive, often disappearing for days at a time. He had taken up with rough company, men whose names Eli did not recognize and did not like. When Eli had pressed him about it, Samuel had grown angry and defensive. They had quarreled bitterly one night in the spring of 1869. Eli had accused Samuel of riding with outlaws, of dishonoring their family name. Samuel had called him self-righteous and blind, said Eli did not understand the world the way it really was. They had nearly come to blows. The next morning, Samuel was gone. He had left a brief note saying only that he was heading west and wanted to be left alone. Eli had honored that wish, though it had pained him. 2 years later, a letter had arrived from a town marshal in New Mexico, informing Eli that Samuel Boone had died in a riding accident and been buried in the local cemetery. No details, no explanation, just the bare facts. Eli had made the journey to that town, but by the time he arrived, the trail was cold. The marshal who had sent the letter had moved on, and nobody seemed to know or remember much about Samuel's death. The grave bore only a simple wooden marker with his name and the year. Eli had stood there in the dusty cemetery, staring at that marker, and felt the weight of all the things left unsaid between them. He had never stopped feeling it. Now, in the fading light of this abandoned barn, Eli unpacked his bedroll and spread it over a relatively flat section of floor. Clementine munched contentedly on some grass he had pulled for her, her tail swishing lazily at flies. The mare seemed at peace here, and that eased something in Eli's chest. If she was content, then perhaps this place would do after all. As darkness settled in, Eli sat with his back against the wall and chewed on a strip of jerky. The barn was full of sounds: the settling of old wood, the scurry of small creatures in the walls, the whisper of wind through the gaps. He thought about what came next. There was work to be done, certainly. He would need to patch the roof before the rains came, shore up the walls, clear away the debris. He would need to find water, too. He had seen what might be an old well near the house foundation, if you could call it that. Just a few stones marking where a structure had once stood, but all of that could wait until morning. Tonight, he was simply grateful to be here, on his own land, with Clementine nearby. It was more than he had dared hope for just a few months ago. He had been working at a ranch near Abilene, knowing his body was failing him, knowing the owner would soon tell him he was too old and slow for the work. Eli had left before that could happen, had taken his pay, and started looking for a way to end his days with some measure of control. The property deed had been listed in a newspaper, stuck at the bottom of a column of land sales. The price was absurdly low, which told Eli everything he needed to know about the quality of the land. But low was all he could afford, and something about the description had pulled at him. 40 acres in the borderlands, barn and well, unclaimed for years. It had seemed like fate, or as close to fate as Eli believed in anymore. He pulled the deed from his pocket now and unfolded it carefully in the dimness. He could barely make out the words, but he had read them so many times he almost had them memorized. The legal description meant little to him, just numbers and directions, but at the bottom was his name, written in the clerk's neat hand, Elijah Boone, owner. It was the first time in his life he had owned anything more than what he could carry. Sleep came slowly. The floor was hard beneath him, and his body ached from the day's ride. But eventually, lulled by Clementine's gentle breathing and the distant call of a nightbird, Eli drifted off. He dreamed, as he often did, of Samuel. In the dream, they were boys again, racing through a field under a wide blue sky, laughing without care. When Eli woke in the deep hours before dawn, his face was wet with tears he did not remember shedding. The next morning arrived cool and clear. Eli rose stiffly, his joints protesting every movement, and set about building a small fire outside the barn to boil coffee. While the water heated, he examined the property more closely in the daylight. The well, as he had thought, was still there, covered by rotted boards. He pulled them away carefully and peered down into darkness. He dropped a stone and heard the distant splash of water. Good. That was one problem solved. The house foundation was just a rectangle of stacked stones, barely visible beneath encroaching weeds. Whatever structure had stood there was long gone, burned or blown away, or simply collapsed into memory. Eli had no intention of rebuilding it. The barn would be home enough. He spent the morning clearing debris, stacking usable wood in one corner and hauling the rest outside. Clementine grazed nearby, her ears flicking occasionally in his direction. By midday, Eli had worked up a sweat despite the cool air, and his back screamed for rest. He was not a young man, and this kind of labor reminded him of that fact with every movement. It was while he was replacing some of the worst floorboards in the northwest corner of the barn that Clementine began behaving strangely. She had wandered closer to the barn and now stood just outside, nickering softly and pawing at the ground. Eli paused in his work and looked over at her. She was staring intently at the ground near the barn's western wall, her ears forward, her whole attention focused on that one spot. Eli set down his tools and walked over to her, placing a hand on her neck. She nickered again, louder this time, and pawed at the dirt. It was not like her to be so insistent. In all their years together, she had never behaved quite like this. Curious now, Eli looked down at the ground she was so intent upon. It was just dirt and dead grass, nothing remarkable. But when he scuffed his boot across the surface, he felt something solid beneath, too solid, too flat to be natural rock. He knelt down, ignoring the protest in his knees, and brushed away the loose soil with his hands. Wood, old wood, weathered gray and smooth. He cleared more dirt, following the edge of whatever lay beneath. A board, no, several boards, fitted together. His heart began to beat a little faster. He stood and went back into the barn, retrieving a short pry bar he had found among the debris. When he returned to the spot, Clementine was still there, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Eli wedged the pry bar under the edge of the boards and pulled. The wood was old but still solid, and it took considerable effort to break it free. When it finally came loose, a dark opening was revealed beneath, a rectangular hole dropping down into blackness. Not a natural formation. This had been built deliberately, hidden intentionally. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he pulled away more boards. The opening was perhaps 4 feet by 5 feet, with crude steps leading down into darkness. A cellar. Someone had dug a cellar beneath this barn and then concealed it, covering it over so completely that time and earth had hidden it from view. His mind raced. Who had built this? Why hide it? And what, if anything, remained below? He thought of Samuel suddenly, sharply, though he could not say why. Just a feeling, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. Eli straightened up and looked around the empty land, the collapsed barn, the bones of the old homestead. Someone had lived here once, had built this place and then left it to rot. The county clerk had said the property changed hands years ago, that no one remembered much about it. But someone had been here. Someone had dug this cellar and hidden it away. The sun was high now, and Eli knew he should probably wait until he had a good lantern and rope before exploring the cellar. But curiosity burned in him, stronger than caution. He was an old man with nothing left to lose. If he fell and broke his neck, well, that was one way for the story to end. He retrieved his lamp from the barn, checked that it had enough oil, and struck a match to light it. Clementine watched him with what might have been concern, but she did not follow as he lowered himself carefully into the opening. The steps were narrow and steep, and he took them slowly, holding the lamp in one hand and bracing himself against the earthen wall with the other. The air grew cooler as he descended, and the smell changed. Less dust, more the deep mineral scent of earth that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. When his feet touched the bottom, perhaps 8 feet below ground level, Eli raised the lamp and looked around. The cellar was larger than he had expected, roughly 10 feet square, with packed earth walls and a low ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. The space was empty except for 3 objects against the far wall, 3 large chests, iron-bound and heavy-looking, sitting silent in the darkness as if waiting. Eli's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had stumbled onto something, though what exactly he did not yet know. He moved forward slowly, the lamplight casting long shadows, and knelt before the first chest. The iron lock had long since rusted through. With shaking hands he lifted the lid. The light of the lamp fell upon gold. Eli had seen gold before, of course. He had held coins in his palm, watched wealthy ranchers count their money, even guarded a payroll shipment once during his younger years. But he had never seen it like this, stacks of gold coins, gleaming dully in the lamplight, filling the chest nearly to the brim. Confederate currency mixed with Union gold pieces, double eagles and half eagles. Coins that bore the faces of long-dead presidents and the symbols of a nation that had torn itself apart and stitched itself back together. His hands moved of their own accord, reaching into the chest, lifting a stack of coins and feeling their weight, real, solid, undeniably valuable. His mind struggled to calculate what he was looking at. Thousands of dollars, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. More money than he would earn in 3 lifetimes of hard labor. Money that could transform everything. The shock of it drove him back onto his heels. He set the coins down carefully, his hands trembling so badly he feared he might drop them. His heart was racing, his breath coming in short gasps. At his age, such excitement was dangerous. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to steady his nerves. The gold had been here for years, maybe decades. It would still be here in a few minutes while he composed himself. Questions flooded his mind faster than he could order them. Whose gold was this? How had it come to be buried beneath this forgotten barn? Why had no one come back for it? The chest itself was old, the iron dark with age and corrosion. The wood beneath the metal fittings cracked and warped. This had been hidden long ago, that much was clear. During the war, perhaps, or in the chaotic years that followed. He thought immediately of the stories every Texan knew, tales of Confederate gold, of payrolls and treasury shipments that had vanished during the war's final days, of Union raiders and Southern sympathizers hiding fortunes that were never recovered. He had always assumed such stories were mostly legend, the kind of thing men talked about over whiskey when they wanted to imagine a different life. But here it was, real and heavy and undeniable, sitting in a cellar beneath land he had purchased with his last pennies. The irony was almost too much. He had bought this place to die in peace, and instead he had stumbled onto a fortune. The question was, what should he do about it? The moral answer seemed clear. Report it, turn it over to the authorities, let them sort out ownership and legality. But another part of him, a part he was not entirely proud of, whispered different counsel. He was an old man with nothing. This gold could buy him comfort, perhaps even a few good years. Who would it hurt? Who even knew it was here? Eli shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. First things first, he needed to see what else was in the cellar. If there was one chest and it was full of gold, then what about the other two? He moved to the second chest, lifting the lamp higher. This one was similar in construction but slightly smaller. The lock here was also rusted through. He opened it carefully. Inside, instead of gold, he found papers. Journals, by the look of them, bound in leather that had dried and cracked with age. Several thick notebooks, their pages yellowed and brittle. A stack of loose documents tied with string. Some maps, folded and refolded until their creases had begun to tear. And beneath it all, a leather pouch that rattled when he lifted it. He opened the pouch and found more coins, but these were different, smaller denominations, a mix of currencies, the kind of money a man might carry for daily expenses. Eli set the pouch aside and carefully lifted out one of the journals. He opened it to the first page and squinted in the lamplight. The handwriting was small and precise. The ink faded to brown. At the top of the page, a name and date, Thomas Brennan, May 1865. Below that, the first entry began, "The war is over, or so they say, but here on the frontier, the old fights continue under new names." Thomas Brennan. The name meant nothing to Eli. He flipped through a few more pages, catching fragments of entries that spoke of travel, of watching and waiting, of money changing hands. Whoever this Brennan had been, he had been involved in something clandestine. The tone of the writing was careful, guarded, full of references to people identified only by initials or nicknames. There was more here than Eli could absorb in one sitting, especially in the dim cellar with his heart still racing. He needed time to read these journals properly, to understand what they contained. But even this cursory glance told him something important. The gold in the first chest had a story, a context, and this Thomas Brennan was part of it. He turned his attention to the third chest, almost afraid now of what he might find. This one was the largest, and its lock was not rusted but broken, as if someone had forced it open with violence. The lid lifted easily. Inside, Eli drew in a sharp breath. A ledger, large and heavy, bound in dark leather. But it was the stains on the cover that caught his attention first. Dark stains, rust-colored where they had dried. Blood, old blood, no mistaking it. Someone had bled on this ledger, and heavily. With reluctant hands, he lifted the ledger from the chest and opened it to the first page. An account book, entries recording ranch expenses and income, dated starting in 1864. The handwriting here was different from Brennan's journal, rougher, less educated. The name at the top read Marcus Haywood. The entries were mundane. Feed purchased, cattle sold, wages paid. The kind of record any ranch keeper might maintain. Eli flipped forward through the pages, watching the dates advance. The handwriting changed partway through, around 1867. Still ranch accounts, but a different hand. No name given. Then near the end of the ledger, the handwriting changed again. This time, Eli's breath stopped entirely. He knew that handwriting. He would have known it anywhere, even after 20 years. Samuel, his brother Samuel's distinctive scrawl, the S's always looping too large, the way he crossed his T's with an upward slash. It was unmistakable. Eli's vision blurred for a moment, and he had to blink hard to clear it. Samuel had been here. Samuel had written in this ledger, had kept accounts for this ranch, had lived on this very property. The property where Eli had come to die in peace was the same. Property where his brother had spent his final years. The entries in Samuel's hand began in 1869 and continued through 1871. Not ranch accounts anymore, or not entirely. The entries became stranger, more cryptic. Cyrus came by. He's getting impatient. Move the goods again. Can't be too careful. The secret is safe for now, but I don't know how long I can keep it that way. And then, on what appeared to be the final page with entries, dated March 15th, 1871, just days before the date of Samuel's reported death, a single line in his brother's shaking hand. Cyrus knows about the gold. I don't think I can stop him. If anything happens to me. The entry ended there, incomplete. The ink was smeared as if Samuel had been interrupted in the act of writing. And at the bottom of the page, trailing across the paper in wild streaks, were the same dark stains that marked the cover, Samuel's blood. This was where his brother had died, or where he had been fatally wounded. Not in some distant riding accident in New Mexico, but here, in this cellar, probably at the hands of this Cyrus mentioned in the ledger. Eli's chest tightened. The lamp wavered in his shaking hand, casting wild shadows on the earthen walls. All these years he had mourned Samuel without knowing the truth. All these years he had carried the weight of their final quarrel, thinking his brother had died alone in some unnamed place, never knowing that Samuel had spent his last years here, on this very land. Caught up in something dangerous involving hidden gold, the pieces were falling together in his mind, though the full picture remained unclear. This Thomas Brennan had hidden the gold during or after the war. Samuel had somehow learned of it, had come here to this ranch, possibly to guard it or claim it, and someone named Cyrus had killed him for it. But the gold had remained hidden, or perhaps Cyrus had never found it. Otherwise, why would it still be here? Eli closed the ledger, his hands reverent now, as if he held something sacred. In a way, he did. This was his brother's last testament, the record of his final days. The lies Eli had been told about Samuel's death were revealed now as exactly that. Lies meant to cover up a murder. The pain of that realization was sharp and fresh, cutting through the scar tissue of old grief. He needed to get out of the cellar. The air felt too close, the weight of the earth above too heavy. He gathered the ledger under one arm, took the lamp in his other hand, and climbed the narrow steps back to the surface. Clementine nickered softly when he emerged, as if she had been worried. He leaned against her side for a moment, feeling the solid warmth of her, grounding himself in something living and present. The sun had moved considerably. He had been in the cellar longer than he realized. His legs were unsteady as he walked back into the barn and sat down heavily on his bedroll. He laid the blood-stained ledger beside him and stared at it for a long time. The gold below represented wealth beyond his imagining. But this ledger represented something more important, the truth about his brother's death, and perhaps a chance to set things right after all these years. Eli had come here to end his days in peace. Instead, he had found a mystery that reached back through 2 decades, a fortune that should never have been hidden, and evidence of a crime that had gone unpunished. The comfortable death he had envisioned was slipping away, replaced by something he had not felt in years, a sense of purpose. His brother deserved justice, even if it came 20 years too late. And this gold, whoever it rightfully belonged to, deserved to see the light of day. He opened the ledger again and began to read Samuel's entries from the beginning, looking for every clue, every name, every detail that might help him understand what had happened here in those final years. The afternoon faded toward evening, but Eli barely noticed. He was no longer just an old man waiting to die. He was a brother seeking truth, and nothing would stop him from finding it. Eli woke before dawn, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, and his mind already racing with questions that had haunted his fitful dreams. He had spent most of the previous evening reading Samuel's entries by lamplight until his eyes burned and the oil ran low. But Samuel's cryptic notes had raised more questions than answers. Now, as grey light crept through the gaps in the barn walls, Eli knew what he had to do. He made coffee over a small fire, the familiar ritual helping to settle his nerves. Clementine grazed nearby, seemingly content with their new home, despite the strange discoveries beneath it. As Eli sipped the bitter brew, he considered his next move. The second chest contained Thomas Brennan's journals, and those might hold the answers he needed. But descending into that cellar again felt like stepping into the past itself, into a darkness that had swallowed his brother whole. Still, there was no other way forward. After finishing his coffee and checking on Clementine's water, Eli gathered his lamp, matches, and a length of rope he had found among the barn's debris. This time he would be better prepared. He tied one end of the rope to a support post in the barn, letting the other end trail down into the cellar opening. If anything happened, if he fell or the lamp went out, at least he would have a way to find his way back. The descent was easier this time, though no less unsettling. The cellar felt different in the morning light that filtered weakly down from above, less ominous, but no less strange. Eli moved directly to the second chest and carefully removed the journals, stacking them beside him. There were 5 in total, each one covering what appeared to be several months of entries. He selected the first, dated May 1865, and settled himself as comfortably as he could against the earthen wall. Thomas Brennan's handwriting, though small, was remarkably clear. The first entry established the journal's purpose. I begin this record as the war draws to its bitter close. My assignment here is delicate, and should anything happen to me, these pages may serve as testament to the service I have rendered. The language was formal, almost military in its precision. As Eli read on, the story began to unfold. Thomas Brennan was a Union operative, sent west in the war's final months to infiltrate Confederate sympathizer networks along the Texas-Mexico border. His cover was that of a discharged soldier seeking ranch work, a common enough story in those chaotic times. His true purpose was to identify and intercept Confederate gold being smuggled south, intended to fund a continuation of hostilities even after the official surrender. Brennan's entries detailed his successful infiltration of a ring of former Confederate officers who were indeed moving gold shipments through the borderlands. He had gained their trust, learned their routes, and finally intercepted a substantial cache, the very gold that now sat in the chest, just a few feet from where Eli sat reading. But here, the mission had gone wrong. Brennan's contact in the Union Army had been killed in a skirmish, leaving him isolated with a fortune in gold and no clear way to deliver it safely. The entries grew more anxious as weeks passed. Brennan feared the Confederate sympathizers would discover his betrayal. He decided to hide the gold and wait for new instructions from Union command. This property, then owned by Marcus Haywood, a man Brennan described as simple and incurious, provided the perfect hiding place. Working alone at night, Brennan had excavated the cellar beneath the barn and moved the chests into it, concealing them carefully. But then, in an entry dated November 1865, Brennan's tone shifted to alarm. "Haywood has grown suspicious of my nocturnal activities. I caught him watching me last night from the house. I must leave soon, but I cannot abandon the gold. It represents Union property recovered at great risk. I've written to my superiors, but no reply has come. I'm trapped between duty and survival." The next several entries were shorter, more hurried. Brennan was preparing to leave, planning to return for the gold once the situation had calmed. He had drawn maps showing the location of the cellar, had written detailed instructions for recovery. But then came the final entry, dated February 12, 1866. "Haywood has set fire to the barn. I smell smoke even as I write this. I believe he means to kill me, to cover up whatever he suspects. I must get out." The entry ended there, the words trailing off. Eli sat in the dim cellar, holding the journal, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air. Thomas Brennan had died here, or very near here, in a barn fire. His mission had failed, his life had ended, and the gold he had recovered for the Union had remained buried and forgotten. The barn had been rebuilt, but the cellar below had remained hidden, its secrets preserved by earth and time. Eli picked up the second journal, hoping for more information, but its first entry was dated March 1866, a month after the final entry in the first journal. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different, relieved, grateful. Brennan had survived. "By grace of Providence or luck, I escaped the fire through a window. Haywood perished in the flames, along with his own house, which caught when the wind shifted. I observed from a safe distance. The authorities will assume I died as well. Perhaps that is for the best. I am marked now, my cover blown. I will disappear into the frontier and build a new life." The remaining entries in the second journal detailed Brennan's travels, his gradual establishment of a new identity far from the borderlands. He never mentioned the gold directly, but several entries referred to the cash I left behind and his intention to one day settle accounts with the past. The journal ended abruptly in December 1868, with no indication of why. Eli set down the second journal and picked up the third. The handwriting here was rougher, less practiced. Not Brennan's hand. The first entry, dated January 1867, was signed by a man named Jacob Mercer. Bought this land cheap from the county. Previous owner died in a fire. Place half burned but salvageable. Will rebuild and run cattle. Mercer's entries were sparse and practical, recording ranch operations with little detail or reflection. He had rebuilt the barn, had worked the land for 2 years, then apparently sold it and moved on. His final entry, dated November 1868, simply said, "Sold property, heading to California. This land is cursed." The fourth journal returned to Brennan's handwriting, but these entries were different, darker, tinged with illness and desperation. Dated starting in January 1869, they documented Brennan's return to the area under yet another false name. He was sick, dying perhaps, and obsessed with recovering the gold before his death. But he could not find the property. It had changed hands, and his old maps no longer matched the altered landscape. There were several entries describing his fruitless searches, his growing frustration, and physical decline. Then in an entry dated April 1869, a breakthrough, "I have found it at last. The property is now owned by a young man named Samuel Boone. He seems trustworthy, desperate for money. I have told him about the gold, promised him a share if he helps me recover it. He has agreed. We begin tomorrow." Eli's hands tightened on the journal. So this was how Samuel had become involved. Brennan had approached him, had revealed the secret. Samuel, always looking for an opportunity, always short on money, had agreed to help. The final entries confirmed this. Brennan and Samuel had excavated the cellar entrance together, had verified the gold was still there, intact and unclaimed. But then Brennan's condition had worsened. The final entry in his hand, dated May 1869, read, "I am too ill to travel. Samuel has promised to guard the gold until I recover. Then we will split it fairly and each go our way. I must rest now. The fever burns so hot." The journal fell open to one last page. Different handwriting here, Samuel's. A single entry, "Brennan died this morning. He made me promise to keep the gold safe, to ensure it was used for good. I buried him under the cottonwood tree on the eastern boundary. May God forgive me, I told no one. I need this gold. I need the chance it represents." Eli closed the journal and sat in silence. The full story was becoming clear now, though it brought little comfort. Samuel had not stolen the gold, not exactly. He had been drawn into Brennan's desperate final scheme, had become its reluctant guardian when Brennan died. But Samuel had also lied, had concealed a death, had convinced himself he deserved the fortune he now guarded. And that decision had led him into the path of Cyrus, whoever that was, and to his own violent end. 2 men dead in this cellar, or because of it. Both of them caught in the web of that hidden gold. And now Eli, who had come here seeking only peace, found himself tangled in the same web. The gold had been Union property once, recovered from Confederate sympathizers. Did that matter anymore, decades later? Who had rightful claim to it now? The government that had abandoned Brennan to his fate? Samuel's heirs, if any existed? Or Eli himself, who had purchased the land in good faith? The questions weighed on him as heavily as the gold in the first chest. He gathered the journals carefully, tucked them under his arm, and climbed back up to the surface. The morning had grown warm, and Clementine greeted him with a soft nicker. He stroked her neck absently, his mind far away in the past, trying to trace the thread of decisions and chances that had led to this moment. He needed to keep reading. There were still 2 journals he had not examined, and the blood-stained ledger contained more of Samuel's story. But first he needed food and rest. His hands were shaking again, and not just from the emotional weight of what he had learned. At his age, this much excitement was dangerous. He forced himself to sit, to breathe, to eat some jerky and drink water, until his heart rate slowed. Clementine stood watch over him like she always had, patient and steadfast. Whatever came next, at least he was not entirely alone. 3 days had passed since Eli first descended into the cellar, and in that time the barn had become both home and archive. He had brought all the documents up from below, spreading them across the cleanest section of floor, organizing them by date and author. The journals, the loose papers, the maps, all of it told fragments of a story that Eli was slowly piecing together. But it was the blood-stained ledger that drew him back again and again, Samuel's final entries that haunted him through the long nights. He had read the ledger cover to cover now, multiple times. The early entries from Marcus Haywood were mundane ranch business. The middle section, in an unknown hand, was similarly ordinary. But Samuel's portion, beginning in 1869, was different. At first, the entries seemed normal enough. Cattle purchases, feed expenses, small profits from selling steers to passing trail drives. Samuel had apparently worked the ranch legitimately for the first year, keeping up appearances while the gold remained hidden below. But then, in late 1870, a new name appeared, Cyrus. The entries mentioning him were brief at first. Cyrus came by asking after work. Told him nothing available. A week later, Cyrus back again. Too many questions about the property. Sent him away. Then, in December 1870, Cyrus knows I'm hiding something. He mentioned Brennan's name. How could he know? Must be more careful. The entries grew increasingly anxious through early 1871. Cyrus demands a partnership. Says he knows about the gold. Says he was part of the original Confederate network Brennan infiltrated. Threatens to expose me if I don't share. The final entries painted a picture of a man trapped. Samuel had written about sleepless nights, about seeing Cyrus watching the property from a distance, about finding his tools moved or his provisions disturbed. He's trying to find the cellar entrance, one entry read. I've concealed it as best I can, but he's persistent. I don't know how long I can hold out. The second to last entry, dated March 10th, 1871, was longer than most. Made a terrible mistake. In the moment of weakness, I offered Cyrus a deal, a small share of the gold if he would leave me in peace. He laughed at me, said he would take it all, that men like me were weak and deserved nothing. I should have killed him then. I should have been stronger. But I am not a killer. I hoped reason would prevail. I was a fool. Then came the final entry, the one Eli had already read in the cellar. Cyrus knows about the gold. I don't think I can stop him. If anything happens to me— The words ended there, interrupted by violence, by the struggle that must have followed. The blood streaked across the page, told the rest of the story in a language that needed no words. But there was something else in the ledger, something Eli had almost missed on his first readings. On the very last page, in the margin beside Samuel's blood-stained entry, someone had written in a different hand. Crude letters, barely legible, looked everywhere. Nothing here. Boone was lying. And then below that a single initial. C. Cyrus had returned after killing Samuel, had searched the cellar and the barn, had failed to find the gold. The hiding place had been too clever. Or perhaps Cyrus had been too hurried, too afraid of being caught with murder fresh on his hands. Either way, he had left empty-handed, believing Samuel had lied about the gold's existence. And for 20 years, the secret had remained buried. Eli sat with this knowledge, turning it over in his mind like a coin that lands differently each time. Cyrus had murdered his brother for gold that he never found, had walked away thinking himself cheated rather than wealthy. There was a grim justice in that, but it did not satisfy the hollow ache in Eli's chest. Samuel was still dead. 20 years had passed. The law had long since closed any investigation, if there had ever been one. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the death certificate he had received 20 years ago, the one that had brought him to that distant cemetery to stand over Samuel's grave. He unfolded it now and read it again with new eyes. Cause of death, injuries sustained in riding accident. Body identified by, he squinted at the faded name, Cyrus Wade, acquaintance of deceased. There it was. Cyrus Wade. The killer had been the one to report Samuel's death, to spin the lie that would protect himself. He had probably buried Samuel in some unmarked spot, then claimed to have found him dead from an accident. A simple story, easily believed on the frontier where such accidents were common. No one had questioned it. No one had dug deeper. And Cyrus had disappeared back into whatever hole he had crawled from, carrying his secret and his failure. Eli carefully refolded the death certificate and placed it atop the ledger. 2 pieces of evidence, 20 years apart, that together told the truth of his brother's murder. But would they be enough to see justice done? And even if they were, what exactly did justice look like after so much time had passed? He stood and walked to the barn entrance, looking out over the land that had cost him everything he owned and given him back a burden heavier than gold. Clementine was dozing in the afternoon sun, her tail flicking lazily at flies. The peace of the scene seemed to mock the turmoil in his heart. A sound made him turn. A rider was approaching from the east, moving slowly through the scrubland. Eli's hand went instinctively to his hip where his revolver hung. But as the rider drew closer, he relaxed slightly. It was a woman, elderly by the look of her posture, riding a sturdy pinto with easy familiarity. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long riding coat despite the heat. She reined up about 20 feet from the barn and called out, "You'd be the new owner, I expect." "Eli Boone?" "I am," Eli answered, stepping into fuller view but keeping his hand near his weapon. "And you?" "Ida Colton. I've got a place about 5 miles west of here. Heard there was finally someone on this property again. Thought I'd ride over and see if you needed anything, being new and all." She dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime on horses. Up close, Eli could see she was probably in her early 70s, her face lined but still strong, her eyes sharp and assessing. She offered her hand, and Eli shook it, feeling calluses as thick as his own. "Appreciate the neighborliness," Eli said. "I've got most of what I need, but I won't turn down advice about the area if you're willing to share it." Ida smiled. "This land has a history," she said. "I expect you're finding that out. Used to belong to Marcus Haywood way back. He died in a fire, barn burned down. Then it changed hands a couple times. Last fellow I remember living here was maybe 20 years ago. Young man, kept to himself mostly. I think his name was Samuel," Eli interrupted quietly. "Samuel Boone. He was my brother." Ida's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that looked like sympathy mixed with caution. "Your brother," she repeated. "I didn't know he had family." "He never mentioned anyone. We were estranged," Eli said. "I didn't know he was here until after he died. They told me it was a riding accident somewhere far from here. That's what we heard too," Ida said slowly. "But there were rumors. Your brother had some rough company toward the end. Men named Cyrus Wade used to come around. They'd argue, loud enough we could hear it sometimes on the wind. Then one day, Samuel was just gone. Cyrus, too. We figured they'd both moved on, like people do out here. Then word came about your brother's death, and Cyrus was the one who reported it. Seemed convenient is all I'll say." Eli felt his pulse quicken. "What else do you remember about Cyrus Wade?" Ida studied him for a long moment as if weighing how much to say. He was a hard man. Had a reputation as a gun hand, worked for some of the cattle barons during the range wars. Not a man you wanted trouble with. "Why do you ask?" "Because I found evidence that Samuel didn't die in any accident," Eli said. The words came out harder than he intended. "I think Cyrus Wade murdered him right here on this property. And I think he got away with it because nobody knew to look closer." The silence that followed was heavy. Ida's weathered face showed no shock, only a grim sort of confirmation. "I always wondered," she said at last. "Your brother seemed afraid those last few weeks. Kept looking over his shoulder. And the way Cyrus left, quick, quiet, no goodbyes, it never sat right with me. Do you know where Cyrus Wade is now?" Eli asked. "Last I heard he was in El Paso. Runs a saloon there, respectable businessman now, if you can believe it. Men like that have a way of landing on their feet." She paused, then added, "You're not thinking of going after him, are you? At your age, at his age, what good would it do?" I don't know yet, Eli admitted. But I need to understand what happened here. I need to know the full truth, even if I can't do anything about it. Ida nodded slowly. Truth is worth having, I suppose. Just be careful. Old snakes are still snakes, even if their venom has dried up. She glanced toward the barn, then back at Eli. Your brother, he was courting someone you know. Margaret, my younger sister. She died in childbirth a few months before Samuel disappeared. The baby survived, but Samuel wasn't around to see her. Margaret always said he loved that child, but I think whatever trouble he was in scared him away from both of them. The words hit Eli like a fist. A child? Samuel had a daughter. Margaret's daughter, Ida corrected gently. Samuel never acknowledged her formally. But yes, I believe she was his. Margaret certainly thought so. The girl's name is Rose. She's grown now, living in Santa Fe with her husband and children. She never knew her father, never knew anything about him beyond what we told her, which wasn't much. Eli's mind reeled. He had a niece, living family, children beyond her, connections he had never imagined. The weight of the gold below seemed to shift in his thoughts, taking on new meaning. This was not just about Samuel anymore, or about justice for a decades-old murder. This was about family, about the possibility of redemption and making something right that had gone so terribly wrong. Thank you, he managed to say. Thank you for telling me. Ida mounted her pinto with practiced grace. I'm glad someone's finally here who cared about Samuel. He was troubled, but he wasn't bad. I hope you find whatever you're looking for. Eli Boone. She touched the brim of her hat and rode off the way she had come. Disappearing into the afternoon heat shimmer, Eli stood watching until she was gone, then turned back to the barn and the secrets it held. Everything had changed again. The gold was not just gold anymore. It was Samuel's legacy, meant for a daughter he had never gotten to raise. And Cyrus Wade was not just a ghost from the past, but a living man who had escaped justice for far too long. The questions remained, heavier now than ever. But at least Eli knew where to look for answers. The ride into Persimmon Creek took most of the morning. Eli had left Clementine with extra feed and water, though it pained him to leave her alone. But he needed information that could only be found in town records, and the old mare deserved a day of rest rather than another hard journey. The borrowed mule from Ida Colton was sturdy enough, if lacking in personality. Persimmon Creek was a tired little town that had never quite fulfilled its ambitions of becoming a major rail hub. The depot stood at one end of Main Street, but only 2 trains a week stopped there anymore. The rest of the street was the usual collection of Western establishments: a general store, a saloon, a bank, a newspaper office, and the county clerk's office in a small building that also housed the town's sole lawman. Eli tied the mule outside the clerk's office and stepped into the dim interior. The clerk was a thin man in his 50s, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he pored over a ledger. He looked up at Eli's entrance with the weary expression of someone who had answered the same questions too many times. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for property records," Eli said. "The old Haywood place, 40 acres out east of here. I'm the new owner, but I'd like to know more about its history." The clerk's expression shifted to mild curiosity. "You bought that cursed land? Well, it's your money. Let me pull the file." He disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a folder tied with string. "Here's everything we've got. Want to look through it here, or should I make copies?" "Here's fine," Eli said, taking the folder to a small table near the window. The light was better there, and he spread out the documents carefully. The chain of ownership was clear enough. Marcus Haywood had filed the original claim in 1862, building the ranch during the war years. The property had passed to the county in 1867 after Haywood's death in the fire. Then it had been sold to Jacob Mercer, who had worked it for 2 years before selling it in 1869 to... Eli's finger stopped on the name. The buyer in 1869 was listed as Thomas Brennan, but that made no sense. Brennan had died in 1869, according to his journals. Unless he looked more closely at the signature on the deed. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, nothing like the flowing script in Brennan's journals. And the date of sale was April 1869, just before Brennan's death. Eli pulled out his own copy of Samuel's entries from the ledger, comparing the handwriting. There was no doubt. Thomas Brennan was a forgery, written by Samuel. Samuel had forged the deed, using Brennan's name to purchase the property. He must have used money from somewhere. Perhaps Brennan had given him funds, or perhaps Samuel had already sold some of the gold secretly. Either way, Samuel had tried to claim legal ownership of the land where the fortune was hidden. A clever move, but ultimately it had not saved him. The next transaction showed the property reverting to the county again in 1872, a year after Samuel's death. Tax default, the notation said. No one had claimed it since then, not until Eli himself had bought it a few weeks ago. 20 years of abandonment, the barn slowly collapsing, the secrets below gathering dust. Eli thanked the clerk and left, his mind working through the implications. Samuel had been smarter than Eli had given him credit for. He had not just stolen the gold, he had tried to legitimize his claim to the land where it was hidden. But something had gone wrong. Maybe he had run out of money for taxes. Maybe Cyrus's threats had scared him into paralysis. Or maybe he had simply run out of time. The newspaper office was his next stop. The editor, a man named Whitmore, was more helpful than Eli had expected. When Eli mentioned he was researching the Haywood place and the deaths associated with it, Whitmore's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a man who loved old stories. The Haywood fire of '66, you mean? That was before my time here, but I've read the old reports. Tragic business. Fire started in the barn, spread to the house. Marcus Haywood died trying to save his livestock, or so they assumed. Body was burned beyond recognition. There was talk of another body found in the barn ruins, but it was never confirmed. Some folks thought maybe a drifter had been sleeping there and got caught in the fire. Do you have the original articles? Eli asked. Whitmore led him to a back room, where bound volumes of old newspapers stood on sagging shelves. They found the relevant issues from early 1866. The articles were brief, as frontier journalism often was. Fire, death, speculation about causes. But one detail caught Eli's eye. Authorities suspect the fire may have been deliberately set, though no suspects have been identified. Haywood was known to have had disputes with several local ranchers over water rights. Deliberately set. So Thomas Brennan's account had been correct. Marcus Haywood had tried to kill him, to cover up whatever suspicions he had developed. The plan had backfired, consuming Haywood instead. And Brennan had watched from a distance, then disappeared into a new identity. There was nothing in the papers about Samuel's death. It had happened elsewhere, been reported elsewhere, and rated no mention in this small-town newspaper. But Eli did find something else, tucked into an issue from July 1871, a brief notice seeking information about the whereabouts of one Thomas Brennan, last seen in the area in 1869. A reward of $500 was offered by the United States Army for information regarding his death or disappearance. So the Army had come looking. Someone in Union command had cared enough about Brennan's fate to investigate. But by 1871, the trail would have been cold. Brennan had died 2 years earlier, and Samuel had already forged the deed in Brennan's name. If Army investigators had come to Persimmon Creek, they would have found records showing Thomas Brennan as the legitimate owner of a ranch he had never publicly occupied. They might have assumed he had died elsewhere, or simply given up the search. Eli copied the reward notice's details into his notebook. It was another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the tangled web. He thanked Whitmore and stepped back out into the afternoon heat. The saloon was busy despite the early hour. Eli ordered a beer he did not really want and listened to the conversations around him. Frontier towns were wells of information if you knew how to listen. He waited until the barkeep had a quiet moment, then leaned forward. "I'm trying to find someone who might remember the area 20 years back," Eli said. "Older folks, long-time residents. Anyone come to mind?" The barkeep, a man with impressive mutton-chop whiskers, thought for a moment. "Old Pete Garrison still comes in most afternoons. He's been here since before the war. Got a memory like an elephant, though his hearing's gone to hell. Wait around a bit and he'll likely show up. Eli nursed his beer and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, an ancient man shuffled in, his gait slow but determined. The barkeep pointed him out to Eli, who carried his beer over to the old-timers table. "Mr. Garrison, my name's Eli Boone. I'm told you've been in these parts a long time. I wonder if I might buy you a drink and ask a few questions." Pete Garrison squinted up at him with rheumy eyes. "Questions about what?" "About the old Haywood Ranch and a man named Cyrus Wade." The old man's expression darkened. "I'll take that drink. But I don't much like talking about Cyrus Wade. He was bad news, that one." Eli bought him a whiskey and sat down. Garrison drank half of it in one swallow, then fixed Eli with a surprisingly sharp gaze. "What's your interest in Wade?" "He killed my brother," Eli said simply. 20 years ago, out at the Haywood place. I'm trying to understand what happened." Garrison nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had long suspected. "Your brother wasn't the first man Wade killed, and I doubt he was the last. Wade ran with some rough outfits back in the day. Range war enforcers, border raiders, men who'd shoot you for the price of a horse. He was smart, though, smarter than most of his type. Always made sure there were no witnesses, always had a story ready. What was he doing in this area?" Eli asked. "Looking for something," Garrison said. "Word was he'd been part of some Confederate gold scheme during the war, and he thought there was money hidden somewhere around here. He asked questions, poked around old properties. When your brother bought the Haywood place, Wade took an interest. Used to see them together sometimes, talking out by the road. Never looked friendly, those conversations. Then one day, both of them were gone. Wade turned up in El Paso a few months later. But your brother, I heard he died somewhere in New Mexico. Riding accident, they said. But I never believed it." "You were right not to," Eli said. "Samuel died at the ranch, murdered by Wade. I've got evidence now, his journals, his ledger. Wade killed him and reported the death as an accident to cover his tracks." Garrison absorbed this with the calm of a man who had seen too much to be shocked. "So what are you going to do about it? Men like Wade, he's probably got friends, protection. Going after him would be dangerous, especially for someone your age. No offense intended, none taken," Eli said. "And I don't know yet what I'm going to do, but I need to understand the whole story first. That's why I'm here." They talked for another half hour, with Garrison sharing what he remembered about those years, the names of other men who had ridden with Wade, the places they had frequented, the rumors that had circulated. It painted a picture of Cyrus Wade as a careful predator, dangerous but disciplined, willing to wait for the right moment to strike, finally. Eli thanked the old man and stepped back out into the late afternoon sun. He had learned a great deal, but each answer seemed to generate new questions. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the morning's journey, his mind too full for easy companionship with his own thoughts. When he finally reached the property, the sun was setting in bands of red and gold. Clementine greeted him with obvious relief, and he spent time caring for her before tending to his own needs. That night, sitting by his small fire with the journals spread around him, Eli began to form a plan. It was dangerous, perhaps foolish, but he was an old man with nothing left to lose except his honor. And that was something he would not surrender without a fight. He would go to El Paso. He would find Cyrus Wade. And he would look the man in the eye when he finally learned the truth about Samuel's last moments. Eli spent 2 more days at the ranch, preparing for the journey to El Paso and conducting one final search of the cellar. Something about Brennan's journals had been nagging at him, a reference to a final insurance that he had hidden separately from the gold. On his 3rd descent into that underground chamber, Eli brought a crowbar and determination. The cellar walls were packed earth, but in several places someone had reinforced them with stones. Eli worked methodically, checking each stone, pressing and pulling, looking for anything that might give way. It was exhausting work for a man his age, and twice he had to climb back up to rest and catch his breath. But on the 3rd attempt he found it, a stone in the northeast corner, about chest height, shifted when he pressed it. Behind it was a small cavity, and within that cavity was an oilskin pouch. Eli's hands trembled as he pulled it free. The oilskin had kept the contents dry despite decades of burial. Inside, he found a bundle of papers and something heavier, metallic. He brought everything up into the daylight to examine properly. The papers were official documents, military orders, correspondence, reports written in official language. They confirmed Thomas Brennan's identity as a Union intelligence operative, detailed his mission in the borderlands, and authorized him to recover Confederate gold by any means necessary. There was also a letter of commendation, signed by a general whose name Eli vaguely recognized from war histories. Thomas Brennan had been a decorated soldier, not a thief, but it was the other item that made Eli's breath catch. A pocket watch, silver and tarnished, but still intact. When he opened it, he found an inscription on the inside of the cover. To Thomas, from Mother Christmas 1862, and behind the watch face. Pressed flat was a small photograph, a young woman holding an infant, her expression serious but tender. Brennan's family, perhaps. People who had never known what became of him, who might still be waiting for word after all these years. Eli closed the watch carefully and set it aside. He had come looking for insurance, evidence that would support his story about Brennan and the gold, and he had found that. But he had also found something more personal, more human. Brennan had not been just a name in a journal. He had been someone's son, possibly someone's husband or brother. The thought weighed on him, but there was one more thing in the cavity. Eli had almost missed it, pressed flat against the back of the space. Another piece of oilskin, smaller and lighter. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, this one more recent than Brennan's family portrait. It showed a young man, Samuel, unmistakably Samuel, though younger than Eli remembered him, standing beside a woman. She held an infant wrapped in white cloth. The woman's face was tired but beautiful, her expression one of cautious hope. Eli turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he recognized as Samuel's, Margaret and Rose, spring 1871. The date confirmed what Ida had told him. This was Samuel's daughter, the niece Eli had never known existed. His brother had kept this photograph, had hidden it along with the other evidence in this secret cache. Why? As insurance, perhaps, or simply as a keepsake of the family he hoped to return to. The photograph made everything real, in a way the journals and ledgers had not. This was not just about gold or murder or abstract justice. This was about a child who had grown up without a father, about a man who had loved his daughter enough to hide her picture in a place only he knew. Whatever else Samuel had been, forger, liar, keeper of dangerous secrets, he had also been a father who cared. Eli tucked all the items carefully into his saddlebag. They would go with him to El Paso. They were proof, evidence, and also responsibility. He could not leave them buried any longer. That night, he visited Ida Colton again. She welcomed him into her modest home, a well-kept ranch house that spoke of decades of careful maintenance. Over coffee that was surprisingly good, Eli told her what he had found, the photographs, the evidence of Brennan's identity, and his plan to confront Cyrus Wade. Ida listened without interrupting, her weathered face thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "You're not a young man, Eli. Neither is Wade, but men like him age differently. They keep their meanness, even when their bodies slow down. What do you hope to accomplish by confronting him?" "Truth," Eli said simply. "I want to hear him admit what he did. I want him to face what he took from Samuel, from Margaret, from Rose. Even if the law can't touch him now, he should at least have to look me in the eye and tell the truth. And if he doesn't, if he lies or laughs or tries to kill you?" Eli touched the old revolver at his hip. "I'm prepared for whatever comes. But I need to do this, Ida. I need to see it through." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll ask one thing of you. Write down everything you found, all of it, the whole story, and leave it with me before you go. If something happens to you in El Paso, someone should know the truth. And more than that, Rose should know about her father. Not just the bad parts, but the whole complicated truth." "She deserves that," agreed, Eli said. He spent the next 2 hours at her kitchen table, writing out the full account of everything he had discovered. The journals, the ledger, the photographs, the evidence of murder, all of it went into a detailed letter addressed to Rose. When he finished, he sealed it in an envelope and handed it to Ida, along with the property deed to his ranch. "If I don't come back," he said, "this land and whatever's on it belongs to Rose. Tell her that her father loved her, and that in the end he tried to do right by her. That's more true than he was a thief or a fool." Ida took both documents and placed them in a strongbox. "I'll keep them safe, but I hope I'll be handing them back to you in a few weeks, along with a piece of my mind for worrying an old woman." Eli smiled, the expression feeling strange on his weathered face. "I'll do my best to make that happen." The journey to El Paso took 3 days. Eli rode slowly, sparing Clementine's aging legs, camping at night under stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than he remembered from his youth. The desert landscape was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all red rock and stubborn plants that refused to surrender to the sun. He used the time to think through what he would say to Cyrus Wade, how he would approach the confrontation. Part of him wanted violence, wanted to draw his gun and see justice delivered in lead. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over the years, knew that revenge was a young man's game. At his age, wisdom meant choosing battles carefully and fighting them with more than just bullets. He reached El Paso on the evening of the 3rd day. The town was larger than Persimmon Creek, more prosperous, sitting on the border with Mexico and serving as a crossroads for trade and travel. Gas lamps lit the main streets, and Eli could hear piano music drifting from several saloons. He found a modest hotel and paid for a room, then asked the clerk about a man named Cyrus Wade. "Oh, sure, everyone knows Cyrus," the clerk said with easy familiarity. "Runs the Silver Dollar Saloon down on Guadalupe Street. Big place, always busy. Cyrus is quite the businessman these days." Eli thanked him and climbed the stairs to his room. From the window he could see part of the town spread out below, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere in those streets was the man who had killed his brother. Tomorrow, after 20 years, they would finally meet face to face. Sleep came fitfully. Eli's dreams were troubled, filled with images of Samuel as he had been, young and laughing, then older and afraid, then finally lying dead in that cellar with blood on his hands and fear in his eyes. When Eli woke before dawn, his face was wet with tears he did not remember shedding. He spent the morning observing the Silver Dollar Saloon from a distance. It was indeed a large establishment, 2 stories tall, with a fancy false front and painted signs advertising the finest whiskey in Texas. Men came and went steadily, and through the windows Eli could see a well-appointed interior with a long bar, gaming tables, and gas chandeliers. This was no rough frontier dive, but a legitimate business catering to merchants and travelers. Around noon, Eli saw him. Cyrus Wade emerged from a side door, smoking a cigar and talking to another man. He was older now, of course, in his early 70s, Eli estimated, but still upright and strong-looking. His hair was white but thick, his face lined but not soft. He wore a good suit and a gold watch chain, every inch the successful businessman. No one looking at him would guess he had murder in his past. Eli watched Wade shake hands with the other man and go back inside. The sight of him, casual, comfortable, prosperous, ignited something cold and hard in Eli's chest. This man had killed Samuel and walked away to build this comfortable life. He had never paid for what he had done, never even had to face questions about it. That was about to change. Eli spent the rest of the day preparing. He cleaned his revolver thoroughly, checked that the cylinders rotated smoothly, loaded it with fresh ammunition he had purchased that morning. He washed, shaved, and put on his cleanest shirt. If he was going to confront a killer, he would do it looking like a man who deserved respect. As evening approached and the saloon began to fill with its nightly crowd, Eli made his way down Guadalupe Street. His heart was beating hard and his mouth was dry, but his hands were steady. He had lived 67 years, had survived a war and decades of hard labor, had buried parents and comrades and finally a brother. He had faced death before. This was just one more meeting, one more reckoning. He pushed open the doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon and stepped inside. The noise washed over him. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, the rattle of poker chips. Nobody paid him any attention, just another old cowboy looking for a drink. But Eli's eyes swept the room carefully, professionally, the way he had learned to observe during his younger years. And there, behind the bar, overseeing his domain with proprietorial satisfaction, stood Cyrus Wade. He was pouring whiskey for a customer, his movements practiced and smooth. He laughed at something the customer said, his expression jovial and open. The perfect disguise for a man with blood on his hands. Eli walked slowly toward the bar, his boots heavy on the sawdust-covered floor. He chose a spot at the far end, away from other patrons, and waited. When Wade finished with his current customer and turned toward Eli, their eyes met for the first time in 20 years. Wade showed no recognition, just the professional smile of a barkeep greeting a new customer. "What'll it be, friend?" "Whiskey," Eli said. His voice was steady. "And answers." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, caution perhaps, or the first stirring of recognition. He poured the whiskey and set it down. "Answers to what?" "To what happened to Samuel Boone," Eli said quietly. "My brother. The man you murdered 20 years ago in a cellar beneath a barn out near Persimmon Creek." The noise of the saloon seemed to dim. Wade's expression went carefully blank, but his hand moved slightly, hovering near his vest where a gun might be hidden. The game was on, and Eli was ready for whatever came next. For a long moment, Cyrus Wade stared at Eli, his face betraying nothing. Then slowly recognition dawned. His eyes narrowed and a smile, not jovial now but cold and calculating, crept across his features. "Boone," he said softly. "You have his eyes. I should have seen it immediately." He glanced around the saloon, assessing the situation. Several patrons had noticed the tension and were watching with interest. Wade's hand moved away from his vest, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. "This isn't the place for this conversation. Give me a moment." He called over his assistant bartender, a younger man who took over the pouring duties without question. Then Wade gestured toward a door at the back of the room. "My office." "We can talk privately there," Eli hesitated. Walking into a private room with a killer was foolish, potentially suicidal. But he had come this far, and he needed to hear Wade speak. He nodded and followed, his hand never far from his revolver. The office was surprisingly refined, a desk of polished wood, leather chairs, accounting ledgers neatly stacked. A large safe sat in one corner. This was the room of a successful businessman, not an outlaw. Wade poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter and sat down, gesturing for Eli to do the same. 20 years, Wade said conversationally. "I wondered if anyone would ever come asking questions. Samuel said he had no family, no one who would care. I suppose he lied about that too." "He didn't lie," Eli said. "We were estranged. I didn't know he was at that ranch until after you'd killed him and reported his death as an accident." Wade sipped his whiskey, studying Eli over the rim of the glass. "So you've pieced it together. I'm impressed. What brought you to my door? Revenge? Justice? Those are young men's pursuits, and we're both well past young." "Truth," Eli said. "I want to hear you admit what you did. I want to understand why." Wade laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Why? Because your brother was a fool and a coward, that's why. He stumbled onto something that didn't belong to him, and instead of sharing it like a man of honor, he tried to keep it all for himself. He got what thieves deserve, the gold," Eli said. "Confederate gold that Thomas Brennan recovered during the war." Wade's eyebrows rose. "So you know about Brennan, too? You've been thorough." "Yes, the gold. I was part of the network that moved it, back when I was young and foolish enough to believe in the Confederacy. When the war ended, most of us scattered, but I heard rumors that one of our shipments had disappeared near the Texas-Mexico border. I spent years looking for it. And then I met your brother. Samuel didn't steal it," Eli said. "Brennan gave him responsibility for it." "Brennan was a Union spy," Wade spat. "He infiltrated our operation, stole that gold, and hid it. By the time I figured that out, Brennan was dead, died in that fire at the Haywood place, or so everyone believed. I would have let it go, moved on with my life. But then I saw Samuel Boone buying the Haywood property, working that land, and I knew he had found the gold. Wade's hand clenched around his glass. I approached him reasonably. I offered partnership, split the gold, both of us wealthy. But he refused, said the gold wasn't his to share, that it belonged to someone else. Some dead spy who had no claim to it anyway. I gave him every chance to be reasonable. So you killed him, Eli said flatly. I defended myself, Wade corrected. Samuel drew on me first. I was faster. What happened after that was survival, not murder. I searched that cellar, the barn, everywhere. Found nothing. Assumed your brother had lied, that there never was any gold, or that someone else had already taken it. I left, reported his death as an accident to cover my involvement, and moved on. Started fresh here in El Paso, built this, he gestured around him, a legitimate life. I'm respectable now. Have been for 2 decades. Eli felt disgust rise in his throat. You killed my brother and called it self-defense. You lied to protect yourself and let him be buried in an unmarked grave far from home. And you've lived well on the foundation of that murder. We all make choices, Wade said, his voice hardening. Samuel made his when he refused to share. I made mine when I pulled the trigger. You're making yours now by coming here. So tell me, Eli Boone, what exactly do you plan to do about it? March me to the sheriff? On what evidence? Your brother's blood is 20 years old, and I have a dozen witnesses who'll swear I've been an upstanding citizen since the day I arrived in El Paso. Eli reached into his jacket, moving slowly so Wade wouldn't misinterpret, and pulled out the blood-stained ledger. He set it on the desk between them. This is Samuel's ledger. It documents your threats, your visits, your search for the gold. And this, he pulled out the photograph. This is Samuel's daughter, Rose. She never knew her father because you killed him before he could go back to her. Wade barely glanced at the photograph. Ancient history. Sentimentality won't bring him back or change what happened? No, Eli agreed. But it changes what happens next. I also found Thomas Brennan's military documents. He was a decorated Union intelligence operative. That gold was Union property, recovered legally during military operations. Samuel was trying to protect it, to ensure it was returned to proper authorities. You killed a man who was doing his duty. Wade's expression flickered, the first sign that Eli's words were having an impact. Union property, he repeated slowly. If that's true, then I suppose the army might still have an interest in it, particularly in knowing who murdered the operative guarding it. They sent investigators in 1871, Eli said. Found nothing. But times have changed. Paper trails are more thorough now. And I have all the evidence they'd need to reopen the case. Wade set down his glass with careful precision. You said you came here for truth, not revenge. So what are you offering, a deal? Eli had anticipated this moment, had played it out in his mind during the long ride to El Paso. A confession, he said. Written, signed, witnessed. You admit to killing Samuel Boone in 1871. In exchange? Wade leaned forward, interested now despite himself. In exchange, I tell you where the gold is, Eli finished. You never found it because Samuel hid it too well. But I have. It's still there, all of it. Tens of thousands in gold coins, maybe more. Enough to make even a successful businessman's eyes water. You confess, properly and legally, and I'll give you the exact location. Wade's eyes lit with sudden hunger. For a moment, the respectable businessman vanished, and Eli saw the man who had killed his brother, the man who would do anything, sacrifice anyone, for wealth. You'd do that, after everything I've done? I came here for truth, Eli said. A confession gives me that, and I'd rather see the gold go to you than have it sit buried forever. At least this way, something comes of all the death and lies. It was a calculated risk. Eli was gambling that Wade's greed would overcome his caution, that after 20 years of wondering about that gold, he couldn't resist the chance to finally claim it. And he was right. Wade's hand trembled slightly as he reached for paper and pen. Written confession, Wade said, already beginning to write. Witnessed and signed. And then you tell me everything. The confession must be detailed, Eli insisted. Every relevant fact, when, where, why, how. Nothing vague. Wade nodded, his pen moving across the page. He wrote quickly, his handwriting rough but legible, detailing the confrontation in March 1871, his search for the Confederate gold, his approach to Samuel Boone, and finally the fatal struggle in the cellar. He described drawing his gun, Samuel's attempt to defend himself, the shot that killed him. He even included his decision to dispose of the body elsewhere and report the death as an accident. When he finished, he read it aloud, then signed it with a flourish. "There, my confession. Now I need witnesses." He called in his assistant bartender and another employee, both of whom looked confused but signed, where Wade indicated without asking questions. He gave them each a silver dollar and sent them away, then folded the confession and handed it to Eli. "Your turn," Wade said. His voice was tight with anticipation. "Where's the gold?" Eli took the confession and carefully placed it in his inside jacket pocket. Then he reached up and pulled aside the collar of his shirt, revealing a tarnished badge pinned underneath. "The gold is exactly where it's always been. In the cellar beneath that barn, hidden in a compartment Samuel built, waiting for proper authorities to recover it." Wade's face went from eager to confused to furious in the space of a heartbeat. I was a U.S. Marshal," Eli said quietly. 20 years ago, I took that badge and that oath. I was investigating Thomas Brennan's disappearance when Samuel died. I went undercover as a drifting ranch hand, trying to gather evidence about border crimes and missing Union operatives. Samuel's death ended my investigation. I couldn't continue, couldn't remain objective. So I retired, turned in my badge officially, and spent 20 years trying to forget. He tapped the pocket where the confession rested. But I never stopped being a marshal in my heart, and I never stopped carrying the badge. What you just gave me, Cyrus Wade, is a signed, witnessed confession to the murder of a man under federal protection. That gold was Union property, which makes Samuel's killing a federal crime. Wade lunged for his gun, but Eli was faster, still fast, even at 67 when it mattered. His revolver was out and aimed, before Wade's hand even reached his vest. "Don't," Eli said simply. The office door burst open. 2 men entered, both wearing badges, El Paso Sheriff's deputies who'd been waiting for Eli's signal. One of them was the assistant bartender who had just witnessed the confession. Not an employee at all, but a deputy in disguise. "Cyrus Wade," the lead deputy said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Boone and for theft of Union Army property." "Anything you say," Wade wasn't listening. He was staring at Eli with something approaching respect mixed with fury. "You played me. All of it. The brother seeking truth, the offer of the gold's location, all a trap." "Not all of it," Eli said. "I am Samuel's brother. I did come here seeking truth, but I came as a lawman, not a vigilante. And you gave me exactly what I needed, your confession in your own hand, properly witnessed, admitting to everything. Federal prosecutors will have no trouble making this case stick." As the deputies shackled Wade and led him away, he called back over his shoulder, "It won't matter. I have lawyers, connections. I'll fight this. Fight all you want," Eli said. "But you confessed. And in the end, that's all the truth anyone needs." When Wade was gone, Eli sat down heavily in the leather chair. His hands were shaking now, the aftermath of adrenaline and decades of pent-up emotion. The lead deputy, a man named Morrison, poured him a fresh whiskey. "That was well done, Marshal Boone," Morrison said. "Taking a risk, though, confronting him alone like that. Had to be believable," Eli said. "If he'd suspected a setup, he never would have written the confession." He pulled out the paper and looked at it one more time. Wade's handwriting, Wade's signature, Wade's admission of guilt. After 20 years, justice was finally within reach. "What happens now?" Eli asked. "Trial in federal court. With this confession, it should be straightforward. Wade's looking at life in prison at minimum, possibly hanging, depending on how the judge views a 20-year-old murder of a federal operative. Either way, he won't see freedom again." Eli nodded. "It was done. The truth was out, recorded in ink and witnessed by law. Samuel's death would finally be answered, his killer finally held accountable, but there was one more thing he needed to do. As Morrison gathered the paperwork and prepared to file formal charges, Eli pulled out the photograph of Samuel with Margaret and Rose, his niece, the family he had never known about until a week ago. The legacy that deserved better than buried secrets and hidden gold. "I need to get back to my ranch," Eli said. "There's someone I need to meet." The journey back to the ranch took 4 days. Eli rode slowly, feeling every one of his 67 years in his bones and joints. The confrontation with Wade had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. Not physically, though that had been taxing enough, but emotionally. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of Samuel's death, and now, knowing the truth, knowing that justice was finally being served, he felt both lighter and more burdened than before. Clementine greeted him with obvious relief when he finally rode into the property. She had been well cared for. Ida had sent her ranch hand over daily to check on the old mare, but she clearly preferred having Eli nearby. He spent a long time just standing with her, his hand on her neck, drawing comfort from her steady presence. That evening, as the sun set in familiar colors over the scrubland, Eli returned to the barn, and the journals he had left carefully stacked in the corner. He had read most of them thoroughly, but something was nagging at him. Brennan had mentioned a final letter, something he had written near the end. Eli had assumed it was among the loose papers in the second chest, but now he wondered if he had missed something. He took the last of Brennan's journals, the one that ended with Samuel's note about the spy's death, and examined it more carefully. The binding was coming loose, the leather dried and cracked. He opened it to the back cover and felt along the edge where the leather met the spine. There's something stiff, something that did not belong. Working carefully with his knife, Eli pried open the back cover's lining. Hidden inside, protected from time and moisture by the leather itself, was a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The handwriting was Samuel's, but this was different from the ledger entries, more personal, more raw. "My dearest Margaret," it began. The date at the top was March 14th, 1871, one day before Samuel's final ledger entry. 2 days before his death. Eli read slowly, his vision blurring with tears as his brother's voice came through across 2 decades of silence. "I am writing this in the small hours before dawn, when the world is quiet and I can think clearly. I should have written sooner, should have come to you weeks ago, but shame has kept me silent. I need you to understand what has happened, why I have stayed away from you and our beautiful Rose. When Thomas Brennan came to me dying and told me about the gold hidden beneath this barn, I saw it as providence, a chance to provide for you and the baby, to give Rose the life she deserves. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that keeping the gold was justified because I would use it for good purposes. But I was lying to myself. I kept it because I was afraid of being poor, afraid of failing you, afraid of being the kind of man my father was. The truth is, the gold has brought me nothing but trouble. A man named Cyrus Wade discovered my secret. He was part of the Confederate network that originally lost this gold, and he claims it belongs to him by right. He has threatened me, followed me, made my life a waking nightmare. I offered to share it with him, to give him half just to be free of his presence. He laughed at me, said he would take it all and leave me dead in the dirt. I am not a brave man, Margaret. I never have been. But I am a man who loves his daughter, who loves you, and who will not let a murderer like Wade take what should be Rose's inheritance. So I have made a decision. Tomorrow night, I'm going to confront Cyrus one final time. I will tell him the gold is his, all of it, if he will leave El Paso and never return. If he refuses, if he comes at me with violence, then I will defend myself and our future. I have moved the gold to a new hiding place within the cellar. Somewhere Wade will never find it, even if he searches for days. If something happens to me, if I do not survive tomorrow night, the gold is yours. Use it for Rose. Give her education, opportunity, everything I never had. Tell her that her father loved her more than gold, more than life itself, and that everything I did was for her. I should have been a better man. I should have gone to the authorities when Brennan first told me about the gold. I should have trusted in honest work and your love, rather than chasing after easy wealth. But I am trying now, at the end, to make things right. I'm trying to be the father Rose deserves, even if she never knows my name. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means Wade has killed me, or that something else has gone terribly wrong. I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry for all the ways I've disappointed you, for all the dreams I promised and could not deliver. But know that in my heart, you and Rose were always— The letter ended there, mid-sentence. The ink was smeared, as if Samuel's hand had been dragged across the page. Eli could picture it, his brother writing by lamplight in the cellar, pouring out his heart, when suddenly he heard footsteps above. Wade coming early, coming unexpected. Samuel would have hidden the letter quickly, shoved it into the journal's back cover, grabbed his gun, and then the confrontation that would end his life. Eli sat with the letter for a long time, tears running freely down his weathered face. This was Samuel's real legacy, not the ledger with its cryptic entries and bloodstains, but this letter full of love and regret and desperate hope. His brother had not been a thief or a coward. He had been a man caught between impossible choices, trying to do right by his family and failing not from lack of love, but from too much of it. The letter changed everything. It was not evidence for the trial. That battle was already won with Wade's confession. But it was evidence of something more important, that Samuel had deserved better than the death he got. That Rose deserved to know her father had loved her. That the truth was more complicated and more human than any simple story of greed and murder. Eli folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket next to Wade's confession. 2 documents, 2 truths, both necessary for what came next. He spent the next 2 days settling his affairs. He rode to Persimmon Creek and sent a telegram to Deputy Morrison in El Paso, confirming his return and asking for updates on Wade's prosecution. The reply came within hours. Wade was in federal custody, trial scheduled for 6 weeks hence, prosecution confident. Eli would need to testify, but his presence had already been accounted for. He also sent a telegram to Santa Fe, addressed to Rose Hernandez, Samuel's daughter, married now and mother to children of her own. The message was simple: I am your father's brother. I have information about him that you deserve to know. If you are willing, I would like to meet. Reply care of Persimmon Creek Post Office. The waiting was difficult. 3 days passed with no response, and Eli began to fear that Rose wanted nothing to do with her father's past. That perhaps Ida's family had told her enough to make her wary of anything connected to Samuel Boone. But on the 4th day, the telegram arrived, coming to Persimmon Creek next week. We'll meet you there. Rose. Eli read the message 3 times, his heart beating faster each time. He had a week to prepare, to decide how much to tell her, to gather the physical evidence that would support his story. The gold, he decided, would remain hidden for now. That was a conversation for after she knew the truth about her father. First, she needed to understand the man Samuel had been, flawed, desperate, but ultimately loving. He spent the week cleaning up the ranch as best he could. He patched more of the barn roof, cleared away debris, made the place look less like a ruin and more like a home. It was not about impressing anyone. Rose was coming to learn about her father, not to judge Eli's housekeeping, but he needed to stay busy. If he stopped moving, stopped working, his mind would spin with anxieties about the meeting. Ida came by on the evening before Rose was due to arrive. She brought food, fresh bread, smoked meat, vegetables from her garden, and her steady, calming presence. They sat by Eli's small fire and talked about inconsequential things for a while, letting the peace of the evening settle around them. Finally, Ida said, "You're nervous." "Terrified," Eli admitted. "What if she hates Samuel for abandoning her? What if knowing the truth makes everything worse?" "The truth is never worse than lies," Ida said firmly. "Margaret told Rose that her father was a good man who died tragically. That was not the whole truth, but it was not a lie either. What you're going to tell her about Samuel's love for her, his attempts to provide for her, his final letter, that will fill in the spaces. It will make him real instead of just a sad story and the gold. Tell her about it after everything else. Let her decide what should be done with it. It's her inheritance in a way, even if it came to Samuel through complicated means. But the letter is more valuable than any gold. Give her that first, Eli nodded. Ada's wisdom, earned through 7 decades of living, was exactly what he needed to hear. They sat together until the fire burned low. Then she mounted her pinto and rode back toward her own ranch. Eli watched her go, grateful for her friendship, for the steady presence she had provided through these strange weeks. That night, he barely slept. He lay on his bedroll, staring up at the barn's patched roof, listening to Clementine's gentle breathing, thinking about the meeting that would come tomorrow. Somewhere in Santa Fe, Rose was probably also awake, wondering about the uncle she had never known, about the father who had died before she could remember him. 2 people connected by blood and tragedy, about to bridge a gap of 20 years. When dawn finally came, Eli rose and prepared himself carefully. He shaved, put on his cleanest clothes, made sure Samuel's letter was safe in his pocket along with the photograph. Then he saddled Clementine for the ride into Persimmon Creek. Whatever happened today, whatever Rose's reaction might be, he would face it with honesty and with hope. Samuel deserved that much. Rose deserved that much, and perhaps after everything so did he. The Persimmon Creek Hotel had a small dining room that served as neutral territory for their meeting. Eli arrived early, his stomach too tight for food, but needing something to do with his hands. He ordered coffee and sat facing the door, watching each person who entered with a mixture of hope and dread. She arrived precisely at noon, just as her telegram had indicated. Eli knew her immediately, though they had never met. She had Samuel's eyes, the same deep brown, the same thoughtful expression, but her face was her mother's, softened by time and life into something beautiful and strong. She was 40 years old now, dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of modest prosperity, her dark hair pulled back in a practical style. 2 people accompanied her, a man about her age, solidly built with kind eyes, and a younger woman, perhaps 16, who shared Rose's features. Eli stood as they approached. Rose's gaze found him, assessed him, and he saw recognition there. Not of him specifically, but of the family resemblance. She could see Samuel in his face just as clearly as he could see Samuel in hers. "Mr. Boone?" she asked. Her voice was steady, controlled, but he heard the emotion underneath. "Eli, please. You must be Rose. Thank you for coming." He gestured to the other chairs. "Please sit." She introduced her husband, Miguel, and her daughter, Elena. They sat carefully, maintaining a polite distance, and Eli understood. They were protective of Rose, uncertain what this meeting might bring. He respected that. "Your telegram said you had information about my father," Rose said without preamble. "Aunt Ida wrote to me years ago telling me he had died. She said it was an accident, that he had been a ranch hand somewhere in New Mexico. But you're his brother, and you've only now come forward." "I have to wonder why, because I only recently learned the truth myself," Eli said. He pulled out the photograph, the one of Samuel with Margaret and baby Rose, and set it on the table between them. "I found this 3 weeks ago, hidden on a property I purchased near here. The same property where your father spent his final years." Rose picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Her eyes filled with tears as she stared at the image of the mother she barely remembered and the father she had never known. "Where did you find this?" "How your father hid it," Eli said gently, along with other things. Evidence of what really happened to him and why. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Rose, your father didn't die in a riding accident. He was murdered by a man named Cyrus Wade, killed in a dispute over hidden gold. It happened on the property I now own, in a cellar beneath the barn. For 20 years, the truth was buried with him. The words fell like stones into water." Rose's face went pale, and Miguel reached over to take her hand. Elena leaned closer to her mother, her young face confused and frightened. Eli hated causing them pain, but there was no gentle way to deliver such news. "Murdered," Rose repeated, testing the word. "All these years," Aunt Ida said, "accident. My mother died believing it was an accident." "Your Aunt Ida didn't know the truth," Eli said. "No one did except the killer. And I didn't know because Samuel and I were estranged. I didn't even know about you until a few weeks ago, when Ida told me." He pulled out Samuel's letter, the precious final words, and held it without offering it yet. "But your father knew about you. He loved you, and in his final hours, he tried to protect your future, even knowing it might cost him his life." Rose's tears were flowing freely now. "How do you know this? How can you be sure?" Eli handed her the letter. "Because he wrote this the night before he died. It's addressed to your mother. He never got to send it, but he wanted you both to know the truth. Read it, Rose. Read your father's own words." She took the letter with shaking hands and began to read. Miguel read over her shoulder, his expression shifting from suspicion to sorrow. Elena watched her mother's face, not understanding everything, but sensing the weight of the moment. The dining room was quiet except for the distant clatter from the kitchen and Rose's soft crying. When she finished, she carefully refolded the letter and pressed it to her chest. "He loved us," she whispered. "He was trying to come back to us." "Yes," Eli said. "He made mistakes. He kept secrets he shouldn't have kept, got involved with things he didn't fully understand. But everything he did, all of it, was because he wanted to give you a better life. That's what the gold meant to him. Not wealth for its own sake, but security for you." "The gold," Miguel said, speaking for the first time. His accent was slight, his tone careful. "This gold that got him killed, does it still exist?" "It does," Eli said. "It's still hidden where Samuel left it, beneath the barn on my property. It belonged originally to the Union Army, recovered from Confederate sympathizers during the war. Samuel was protecting it for a Union operative who died before he could return it to proper authorities. The man who killed Samuel, Cyrus Wade, he's in federal custody now. I saw to that. He confessed to the murder, and he'll spend the rest of his life in prison for it." Rose looked up at him with Samuel's eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, from grief to gratitude, from pain to understanding. "You brought him justice. After all these years, you made sure the man who killed him paid for it. I did what Samuel would have wanted," Eli said. "What any brother should do. But there's more." He pulled out the official documents, Brennan's military papers, the property deed, the ledger. "The gold is complicated. Legally, it might still belong to the federal government, or it might be considered abandoned property, which would make it mine by right of the land purchase. Either way, I believe Samuel would have wanted you to have it. It was always meant for you. I don't want blood money," Rose said quietly. "It's not blood money," Eli corrected gently. "It's history. It's the treasure of dead causes and forgotten wars. Your father died protecting it because he believed it could give you the future he couldn't provide himself. You can refuse it, certainly. You can insist it go to the government or be donated to charity. But you should make that decision knowing what Samuel intended." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her hand still clutching the letter, her other hand held tightly by Miguel. Finally she spoke. "I want to see the place where he died. I want to stand where he stood, see what he saw. Can you take me there?" Eli had hoped she would ask. "Yes, tomorrow if you're ready. You and your family are welcome to stay at the ranch. It's not much, but there's room in the barn, and the land. It's peaceful there. I think you'd understand why Samuel stayed, why he thought it could be a home." Rose nodded, wiping her tears. "Tomorrow, then. But tonight," she looked at the photograph again, at the letter, at all the evidence of a father she had never known. "Tonight I need time to think about all of this, to mourn what I never had, and to be grateful for what I'm learning now. Take all the time you need," Eli said. "Samuel waited 20 years for this truth to come out. We can wait one more night." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Eli led the way on Clementine, while Rose, Miguel, and Elena followed in a rented wagon. The journey took 2 hours, and during that time, Eli found himself telling them stories about Samuel as a boy, the good memories from before the war, before the estrangement. Rose listened hungrily, storing away every detail about a father who had been nothing but absence until now. When they arrived at the ranch, Eli saw it through their eyes, the weathered barn, the scrubland stretching to the horizon, the simple beauty of isolation. Rose climbed down from the wagon slowly, her gaze taking in everything. She walked to the barn entrance and stood there, one hand on the weathered wood. "He lived here," she said softly. "He walked through this door. He saw this same view for almost 2 years," Eli confirmed. "From 1869 until March of 1871. He worked the land, kept cattle, tried to build something. And he thought of you. That letter proves it." Rose turned to him, tears already forming. "Can I see where it happened?" The cellar? Eli had prepared for this request. He'd cleaned the cellar as best he could, removed the worst of the debris, brought down a good lantern. But nothing could change what that space represented. He nodded and led them to the concealed entrance, now uncovered and fitted with a crude ladder he had built to replace the treacherous old steps. "It's steep," he warned, "and the space is tight. You don't have to go down if you'd rather not." "I need to," Rose said firmly. Miguel nodded his support, though Eleanor chose to remain above with Clementine, who had taken an immediate liking to the girl. Eli descended first, lighting the lantern and making sure the space was safe. Then Rose came down, followed by Miguel. In the lamplight, the cellar looked less ominous than it had on Eli's first visit, but the history hung heavy in the air. Rose stood in the center, turning slowly, taking in the earthen walls, the support beams, the 3 chests against the far wall. "Here," she whispered. "He died here." "Yes," Eli said. "Wade came for the gold. Samuel tried to defend himself. It was quick, I think. The ledger shows it happened suddenly. Samuel was writing, and then he gestured to the bloodstains still faintly visible on the floor. "I'm sorry you have to see this." Rose knelt down, her fingers hovering just above the stains. "Don't be sorry. This is real. This is what happened to my father, and I need to see it. To understand it." She looked up at Eli, her face composed despite the tears. "Show me the gold. Show me what he died protecting." Eli moved to the first chest and opened it. Even in the dim light, the gold gleamed. Rose and Miguel stared, their expressions shifting from shock to something harder to name. Here was the fortune that had cost Samuel his life, the treasure that had brought nothing but tragedy to everyone who touched it. "It's worth," Miguel began, then stopped, unable to even estimate. "Tens of thousands," Eli said. "Maybe more, depending on current gold prices. Enough to change your family's life completely. Enough to fund Elena's education, to buy a real ranch, to secure your futures for generations." Rose reached out and touched a single coin, lifting it gently. Confederate gold and Union pieces mixed together. "The treasure of a dead war bought with my father's blood." She looked at Eli. "What would you do with it if it were yours?" Eli had thought about this question for days. "I'd split it 3 ways. 1/3 to the federal government. It was Union property once, and they should get something back. 1/3 to causes Samuel would have approved of, maybe a fund for children who lost parents too young, something that would have helped you. And 1/3 to you and your family, because that's what Samuel wanted. He wanted you provided for." Miguel spoke carefully. "That's generous. But this is your property. You bought the land legally. The gold could be considered yours by right. I bought the land with my last $800, Eli said. I was looking for a place to die in peace. Instead, I found my brother's legacy and a niece I never knew I had. The gold means nothing to me compared to that. I don't need wealth. I need family. I need to know that Samuel's death meant something, that Rose got what he wanted her to have. Rose stood and embraced him suddenly, fiercely, this uncle she had known for less than a day. Eli held her, feeling the weight of 20 years of grief and loss finally begin to lift. She was crying, and so was he, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and connection and the beginning of healing. I'll accept your plan, Rose said when she finally pulled back. 1/3 to the government, 1/3 to charity in my father's name, 1/3 to our family. But, she looked around the cellar one more time, I want something else too. I want to bury my father properly. His body is in some unmarked grave in New Mexico, but his spirit is here. I want to mark this place, to honor what he tried to do. Can we do that? Yes, Eli said immediately. We'll build a marker, right here on the property, under the cottonwood tree where he buried Thomas Brennan. They can rest together, two men caught up in the same tragedy, both trying to do right in impossible circumstances. They climbed back up into the sunlight, where Eleanor was braiding flowers into Clementine's mane. The girl looked up as they emerged, saw her mother's tear-stained but peaceful face, and smiled uncertainly. Rose went to her daughter and pulled her close. Your grandfather was a complicated man, Rose told her. But he loved you, even though he never got to meet you. And because of him, because of what he left behind, our family's future is secure. We're going to honor him, Elena. We're going to make sure his sacrifice meant something. That evening, they sat around a fire outside the barn. 4 generations connected by blood and tragedy, and now, finally, by truth. Eli told more stories about Samuel, the good and the bad, painting a full picture of a man who had been neither saint nor villain, but simply human. Rose shared what little she remembered of her mother, the stories Ida had told her, the life she had built, despite growing up without parents. Miguel proved to be a thoughtful man, asking good questions about the legal process ahead, about how they would handle the gold's division, about practical matters that needed addressing. Elena, slowly warming to this great uncle she had just met, asked if she could come back to visit, if maybe Clementine could teach her about horses. Any time, Eli said. This land belongs to you now in a way. Your grandfather's blood is in this soil. You're welcome here always. As the fire burned low and the stars came out in their thousands, Eli felt something he had not experienced in decades: contentment. He had come to this place expecting death and instead had found family. Samuel's tragedy had led to this moment of connection, this chance to make things right. The gold would be divided fairly, justice would be served, and Rose would finally know the truth about the father who had loved her. It was enough. It was more than enough. 6 weeks had passed since that first meeting in Persimmon Creek, and the ranch had transformed in ways Eli would not have thought possible. The barn stood straighter now, its roof properly patched, its walls reinforced. A small garden had been planted near the old well, its vegetables already pushing up through the dark soil. Fencing had been repaired along the eastern boundary, and a new lean-to stood beside the barn, a gift from Miguel, who had insisted on contributing labor even as the family prepared to return to Santa Fe. Clementine grazed contentedly in the afternoon sun, her coat glossier than it had been in years. Elena had spent hours grooming her during their stay, and the old mare had responded with obvious affection. Some animals knew kindness when they found it, and Clementine had decided the girl was worth keeping around. Eli stood in the barn doorway, watching Rose and Miguel load their wagon for the journey home. The trial had concluded 2 days ago in El Paso. Cyrus Wade had been sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Samuel Boone and theft of federal property. The judge, a stern man who had served in the Union Army himself, had shown no mercy. Wade would die in prison, his comfortable life in ruins, his crimes finally answered for. The gold had been divided exactly as Eli had proposed. 1/3, nearly $20,000 in current valuation, had been returned to the federal treasury with full documentation of its origin and recovery. The government had even issued Eli a commendation for his service in recovering lost Union property and bringing a murderer to justice. He kept the certificate in his saddlebag. Though he rarely looked at it, another 1/3 had gone to establishing the Samuel Boone Memorial Fund, administered through a bank in Santa Fe. The fund would provide educational support for children who had lost parents, a legacy that would touch lives for generations. Rose had been adamant about this. Her father's mistake should become someone else's opportunity. The final 1/3 belonged to Rose and her family. enough money to buy a proper ranch near Santa Fe, to send Eleanor to the best schools, to secure their comfort for the rest of their lives. Rose had tried to give Eli a portion, but he had refused. His needs were simple, and he had already received the only payment that mattered: family connection. The knowledge that Samuel's death had meant something after all. Under the cottonwood tree on the eastern boundary, 2 markers now stood. The first bore Thomas Brennan's name and dates, along with a simple inscription, "Union Operative, Faithful unto Death." The second was for Samuel. Samuel Boone, 1844-1871, beloved father, died protecting his daughter's future. Rose had chosen the words carefully, and Eli thought Samuel would have approved. The truth of his life was more complicated than any stone could capture, but this truth was the one that mattered most. Rose approached Eli now, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Her face was peaceful, the grief of 6 weeks ago transformed into something gentler, acceptance perhaps, or the beginning of healing. She handed him the bundle. "I want you to have this," she said. "It belonged to my mother's family, passed down through generations. Aunt Ida kept it safe all these years, but she says it should come back into the family line. Your family, Uncle Eli. You're the one who brought us all together." Eli unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a Bible, old and well-worn, its leather cover soft with age and handling. He opened it to the front pages where family records were traditionally kept. Names and dates stretched back more than a century. Births, marriages, deaths, the chronicle of lives lived and ended. His finger traced down the entries until he found Margaret's name, and beside it, Rose's birth recorded in fading ink. "Look at the last entry," Rose said softly. Eli turned to the final page with writing. There, in fresh ink not yet fully dried, was his own name. Elijah Boone, born 1824, brother to Samuel Boone, uncle to Rose Hernandez. Found family again in the autumn of his years. Added to this record, October 1891. His vision blurred. He had spent his whole adult life without family, without connections that went deeper than temporary work and borrowed bunks. He had come to this abandoned land expecting to die alone. Instead, he had found what every person seeks: a place to belong, people to matter to, a legacy that would outlast him. "Thank you," he managed to say. "This means more than you know." Rose embraced him, and then Miguel shook his hand with genuine warmth, and Elena hugged him with the unself-conscious affection of youth. They had become family, not through decades of shared history, but through truth honestly told and grief honestly faced. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. He watched them ride away, the wagon disappearing into the distance, and felt no sadness. They would return. Rose had already promised to visit in the spring, to bring the whole family, perhaps even to stay for a few weeks. This ranch was theirs as much as his now, a place where Samuel's memory lived on, in the land he had tried to protect, and the family he had died for. Eli walked back to the barn, the Bible tucked carefully under his arm. Clementine followed him inside, her presence comforting as always. He had repairs to finish, work to do, a life to continue living. But for this moment, he simply sat on his bedroll and opened the Bible again, reading through the names of people he had never known, but who were now his ancestors, his family, his connection to something larger than himself. The sun set through the barn's western gaps, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in El Paso, Cyrus Wade sat in a prison cell, facing the consequences of his choices. Somewhere in Santa Fe, Rose and her family were planning their future, built on the foundation of truth and justice. And here, in this barn on this patch of scrubland that had seemed worthless 6 weeks ago, Eli Boone sat with his horse and his Bible and his peace. He had come here to die. Instead, he had learned to live again. The gold was gone, divided and distributed, but the real treasure remained: family, truth, the knowledge that he had done right by his brother and his niece. Samuel's story had ended in tragedy, but it had also led to this: reconciliation, justice, hope. As darkness settled fully and Eli lit his lamp, he thought about what he might write if he were to add anything to that Bible. perhaps something simple. Found peace at last in the place I least expected. Made things right when it mattered most. But the words could wait. Tonight, he was content simply to sit in the barn that no longer held secrets, on the land that had given him back his family, with Clementine breathing softly nearby. Sometimes the hardest truths were buried right beneath our feet, waiting to be found. But once found, once faced honestly and courageously, they could transform everything. Eli had learned that lesson in the autumn of his life, and it was enough to carry him through whatever days remained. The desert wind whispered through the barn's gaps, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Eli closed the Bible, placed it carefully with his few possessions, and lay down to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, perhaps new visitors. But tonight he had everything he needed: peace, family,